The way most people think about climate change, I think, is in terms of hot, dry days. But in fact, climate change affects a whole bunch of things.
Global temperature is rising. We used to call that just global warming, but now we realize that with temperature rise comes all sorts of other impacts on the climate.
And we see changes in the patterns of rainfall around the world. There's going to be a lot more drought and wildfires. So basically, like all the extreme events that are really damaging to societies around the world are going to keep happening, and they're going to become a lot more intense in the future.
Climate change. I think this word it obscures a lot of things. You know, you've heard global warming, climate change. I like to use the term climate crisis or climate, disruption, because it really points to what's really going on.
Change sounds pretty benign. It sounds pretty good. Hey, change is good, isn't it? And it also sounds like it's an unmoved mover. In other words, who's causing the climate change? But if we call it human-caused climate disruption, then we're pretty sure we know who's causing it.
Really, as long as we've been human beings, we've been altering our climate and environment. So even 40,000 years ago, first moving to Australia, you can see that hundreds and hundreds of species immediately go extinct once human beings get there. We've always been changing the environment. But more recently, with respect to the climate, we've been digging up and burning an awful lot of fossil fuels.
The cause that I think a lot of people are focused on, and that is the use of fossil fuels in all aspects of life, particularly in so-called advanced industrialized societies.
So what we've been doing is just taking all of the carbon that's been stored deep in the earth and putting it up into the atmosphere. And so this is what we call greenhouse gas emissions. So mostly due to CO2, but there's some other greenhouse gases as well, and we've just been dramatically increasing how much is in the atmosphere and trapping more and more heat.
The broader cause, and the more important cause, isn't just the use or the burning of fossil fuels, it's the lack of democracy, the lack of equality across and within societies. If people were fully aware of the impacts of fossil fuel, we would have far fewer examples of societies burning the hell out of fossil fuels, because people would have much more say over public policy.
A lot of people think that climate change is something far away out there, not affecting people today. I think we have to demystify how climate change is affecting people. And Rob Nixon wrote a book called Slow Violence, and he talks about how it's really hard to represent something that is so slow and incremental, yet so violent and so sort of historically embedded. And so I think it's important that we think about climate change's impacts as having happened over time, and how is it impacting communities locally. It's impacting us through wildfires, through the nexus of wildfires and heavy rainfall that lead to debris flows. And we're seeing coastal erosion. All of these things have causes that are not directly linked to climate change, but the frequency of these things is increasing, and so climate change is definitely part of what's making these things even more catastrophic. And so in the local community, I think that we are seeing it, but not necessarily connecting it to climate change.
I'm interested in how climate change will affect climate variability. And so one area that I've been looking at is drought. And if you look back in time, before the start of the observational record, we can make these paleoclimate reconstructions using tree rings, depending on how much moisture is available for the tree. And we can get a sense from that of how strong droughts were in the past. And when you do that, you find that droughts that are even more severe and prolonged than anything we've seen in the 20th century have occurred in the past. So we're talking droughts that last for 20 or 30 years and are very intense. And so that's how they got the name mega droughts, because they're, big, right? So one thing that I work on is trying to use these big computer models to study how mega droughts will respond to climate change. So we're able to simulate them in the model and then kind of get a sense for, based on the physics of the climate system, how the droughts will change in the future. And it looks like, because of the background warming of the land surface, that's going to drive more evaporation and make droughts more intense in a lot of places, in particular here in the western US. So you can imagine that if you have some variability in drought to begin with, but then you superimpose that on a drying trend, then the amount of time you're below some threshold that we now consider a drought is going going to increase a lot in the future. What we think of now as a mega drought is going to just become normal very soon. The drought that we had at the start of the millennium could be considered a mega drought by some definitions. We're out of that now, I believe, but it looks like we might go back into drought soon. But yeah, in general, what your research is showing is that we are in kind of perpetual danger of a mega drought because of this trend towards background drying that we're seeing as a result of climate change. That doesn't mean that like we can't do things to prepare. It just means that we need to be aware that we might need to kind of change our expectations about how much water will be available in the future.
Local disasters such as the forest fires in California and in Santa Barbara are clearly at least partly caused by climate change. Like there are certainly other changes. As Santa Barbara has spread, a lot of people have moved out into the hills and those nice lovely green places, which makes it much easier for them to burn down. So it's not just a story about climate change. That's important to recognize. But a big part of it is climate change. It's warmer, it's hotter, the rains will come earlier in the year according to climate forecasters, and therefore there's less rain later in the year when we need it to help put out forest fires or to prevent them from starting. So fire seasons are getting worse. I mean, there are a lot of small incremental changes like that make this not as nice a place to be as it used to be.
We're living in a new normal where we need to be able to deal with wildfire, and with it being both happening more often and also often being a more severe fire, so a more problematic fire if you're living in the line of that fire. And as we know in Santa Barbara, where we just recently experienced the Thomas Fire, and then this year the Cave Fire that were very close to town, both of them. And actually following not that far on prior fires that happened in the 2010s. So we're seeing this again and again. I'm hopeful that we can turn that energy that seems to lead to these fuels management projects into a bit more long-term preparedness, so that yes, this community does more after a fire, but it does more to decrease risk over the long term, so that there's more preparedness over the long haul rather than in just a short management of fuels perspective. And so I've been thinking a lot about that, especially in the wake of the Montecito mud flows as well. We did a survey of Montecito residents after the debris flows to see how prepared they were, to try to learn some lessons from what happened. And one of the great things is we found that Montecito residents actually are really prepared. So they have evacuation plans, they're signed up for emergency alerts, they're doing work on their houses to make them more ready for wildfire. And so actually I think Montecito is bending that curve a little bit, bending down the risk curve. One challenge is then to think about, well, it'd be nice if we didn't have to have a wildfire to do those things, right? If we could transfer what we've learned here to other communities that share our risk profile for wildfire, for debris flows, and get them to also be prepared without having to experience this very damaging event. I split people into two groups basically and told some of them about the damages that had happened in their state from disasters. And the other half of them, I said that same thing about damages, except I said it was predicted to happen over the next 10 years. And what we found in that project is that people who were exposed to the story about the past 10 years were much more supportive of disaster management projects, of preparing for disasters. And so what I learned from that is that our stories are really important. And telling the story of the past is just fine, as opposed to thinking that we need to be able to predict the future in order to motivate people. If wildfire is going to get more common, we need to do a better job of preparing our own houses, families, and plans for that.
So when I first came into this position, it was in 2017 in the summer, and I was just getting started, and the Thomas Fire happened. And the Thomas Fire turned into one of the largest wildfires in California history, and since has been surpassed. I remember being stuck inside. A lot of people left. They were afraid of being exposed to the toxic particulate matter. And I stayed at home and I kind of shut myself in and I watched the news. And people started to come home for the holidays and it started to clear up a little bit. But there was this nagging concern that I would see among public officials about the rain. So this is a winter fire, it's very unusual. And so I remember I was a new faculty member and the debris flow in Montecito happened, and I kind of watched that unfold from Santa Barbara, and I felt somebody's got to do something about this. And so we formed a research team, and I started collecting interviews with people, and I'm still processing 2 years later what all of that interview material is trying to tell us about how to prevent these kinds of disasters. And it turns out, here you have fire, rain, a debris flow that wants to go to the ocean, but it's being kind of blocked up by urban development or, the built environment, and causing all kinds of damage as it tries to get to the ocean. What do you do with all that sediment? How do you manage that? So what the city started doing with emergency permitting is loading it up in trucks and taking it to Goleta Beach and dumping it there. And this created a lot of concern among environmentalists, what's going on at Goleta Beach? You're dumping toxic sediment. Is it fair that you're cleaning out, a wealthy community and dumping it on a public beach? I started thinking about this question, and I learned more about Goleta Beach that I didn't realize that I think is important. Who uses the beach? So there's a survey done in 2015 that showed that predominantly low-income families use the beach, people of color. They started the survey process in English and realized almost like halfway through that, we need to actually conduct interviews in Spanish. And so they got more data from people who don't speak English. And it turns out that this beach is widely used by people who are from the area, who are low income. They're 9 times more likely to visit the beach. And yet it's being treated as sort of a dumping ground, right? And so this raises questions about coastal justice. You have issues in Hollister Ranch about access and people not being able to get into a privately owned beach and what that means. But here you have in Goleta, one of our nearby beaches that is widely used by the public being dumped on. It turns out it's a bigger issue. So sea level rise and erosion has been going on at Goleta Beach for many years, and there's always been a lack of sediment there. And so the beach was washed out by a storm before all of this happened. And so the justification for dumping there was, it needs sediment. And ironically, it actually grew the beach out and became a beach again. And it's a really complicated story, but it shows how managed our coastal assets really are, and how, the flows of vulnerability work across different kinds of disasters and future problems with coastal erosion and sea level rise. And we're already experiencing that here. And it goes widely unnoticed. So many people are not even aware, right? And so I think that that's the challenge. So when we think about adaptation, how do we connect all of these things together? How do we connect the problem of a debris flow that could happen with the problem of a beach that the public utilizes, one of the few remaining public beaches that is accessible anymore in this area, which is really heavily touristed, right? And a lot of tourist economy coming in. How can we balance those things? And I think those are the kinds of questions we need to be asking. And there's always going to be winners and losers in what to do with a place like Goleta Beach. Let it succumb to the natural environment. Let them reconstruct the seawall there to protect it. Move it. So we're seeing some of these discussions happening in our backyard. And I think the same applies for Isla Vista as properties are being condemned as the bluff starts to collapse and erode and creating all kinds of hazards and problems for our students. We need to start making connections between what's going on in our backyard, what's going on upstream, what's going on with fires and floods and erosion. And if we don't make those connections, we're not going to be able to solve the problem. We also need to know who uses these spaces. What are the social cultural contexts that these disasters and future disasters entering into? We have a situation in Santa Barbara where here's a public beach where you can park for free. Where can you go in Santa Barbara and park for free? So it's no mystery why that beach is utilized by low-income families. And so losing it raises all kinds of other questions.
A lot of the work that I do focuses on how people in low and middle income countries are responding to environmental change. And some of the things that I see in my work are everything from declining yields for farmers to the loss of viability of certain settlements near the coast to changing access to power because of larger storms, to decrease in resources that people are traditionally using for their livelihood. So it really touches on almost everything that we think about as being important for human well-being, and it's especially problematic for people in low and middle income countries who often don't have the same resources to adapt to changes in the climate and therefore the environment that they're in. We are going to see a lot of agricultural systems that are going to need to shift both locations and the types of crops grown. So there's a lot of work right now that focuses on how do you help farmers adapt to a changing climate. There's also going to be important questions about flooding and coastal resilience with sea level rise. And so there are countries where many places will no longer be viable as a location for human settlements because of sea level rise. I think particularly of Bangladesh, I've heard estimates that, a good proportion of the people that live in Bangladesh will be underwater in the next 50 years if sea level rise proceeds as we expect it to. And so the transitions that people in low-income countries will have to make are significant, and it's made more problematic by the lack of resources that many of their governments have to address the problem. As landscapes become impossible to live in, to grow crops, then it's going to increasingly drive migration both inside of countries, so to cities. You see massive rates of urbanization around the world where cities are being overwhelmed with the amount of people that are coming in and the speed with which they're coming in to provide basic services. Then questions about climate refugees and how the world is going to address the fact that many people are going to have to move under climate change, and we don't have a political system that is very well suited to help us accommodate the needs of those people.
The Maldives is an interesting case because the Maldives is a small island country in the middle of the Indian Ocean. At one time, it was really sort of in the news all the time. It was the poster child of climate justice. Here you have this small island that a lot of people framed as sinking, right? Unless we did something to mitigate carbon emissions. So yes, climate change is destroying the coral reefs, which serve as an important barrier for waves and things like that. It's undermining ecosystems that, are dynamic, that create more land mass and things like that over time. But people are struggling in the Maldives with something a little more urgent, and it's about human rights. So there's this huge authoritarian wave of oppression that's happened in the Maldives. And so when you go there and you ask people what do you think about sea level rise or climate change, that is not in the forefront of their minds because they don't separate human rights from the struggle for climate justice. Because what's the point of advocating for climate justice if there's a totally totalitarian existence?
Rich, well-developed countries in the world have contributed most to climate change. The US, Western Europe, increasingly China, by the way. And the developing countries are going to suffer a great deal of the pain. Crops are going to be failing, there's more flooding, and their housing is not very well prepared to deal with it. There are a whole bunch of things which are bad things which are happening to developing countries and people in them, including the fact that they're going to have to migrate to other areas or other countries. So it's a terrible situation for them. It's about as unjust as you can get, and it's going to be playing out over the next few decades. Everybody who's listening to this is going to be alive when these things are happening.
Basically, in environmental justice, in the most simple terms possible, is about the right to be free of environmental destruction. It's about recognizing, or the notion that everybody, regardless of race, gender, income level, sexuality, has a right to the environmental goods and also a right to protection from environmental harms. It's also about including everybody. So the idea that everyone should be involved in shaping processes of creating environmental law, implementing those processes, enforcing them.
So I want to be very clear that people often use the term climate justice and environmental justice to mean the same thing as climate injustice and environmental injustice or environmental racism. For me, climate injustice is very similar to environmental racism. It's that intersection between social inequality and environmental or climate harm. So again, when people who are already marginalized in their communities, socially, politically, ethnically, culturally marginalized for whatever reason, their gender, their race, their class, their citizenship status, their ability, those folks are much more likely to get hit hardest by the events of climate disruption. And they're of course also more likely to get hardest hit by just a broad spectrum of environmental threats, climate being just one of them. Climate justice is the opposite of that. Environmental justice is the opposite of that. That's what we want. That is a vision and a practice of communities and societies where equity, where democracy, where social justice exist simultaneously in spaces where we're actually addressing our environmental crises, where we're addressing our climate crises. So climate justice is this vision of where we're simultaneously addressing the problem of climate disruption and achieving social justice, and understanding that those things are never separate, that they're always entangled. According to statistics I've seen, something like 6 or 7 nations and 100 companies are responsible for at least 70% of historic fossil fuel emissions, so I can blame them. The wealthiest people and the wealthiest societies and the wealthiest shareholders and the wealthiest corporations on the planet, they deserve the blame, not because it's my opinion, but because factually they have actually contributed to the vast majority of atmospheric climate gas emissions. And this of course gets to the point about what climate injustice and climate justice might be, right? It's an injustice that people in places like sub-Saharan Africa and other parts of the global south are bearing the primary brunt of climate disruption when they have contributed the least to the problem. So it's a double whammy. They're getting hit hardest, and that'd be fine if you were in Beverly Hills or Manhattan, in a penthouse in Trump Tower. You deserve to get hit the hardest because you contributed the most. But that's not happening to those people. It's happening to people who've actually contributed the least to the problem.
We know that if you have more money, more education, you probably have more time. You probably have a network that includes the people you need to call to make change. You have just more kind of capacity to organize, to respond. And so I worry a lot about this, because if we're seeing an even bigger gap between these two communities, then we need to be thinking about how we get resources to the communities that aren't as easily able to mobilize. And so it's not just an impact story, but also a response story. So we'll definitely have big implications for environmental justice.
I'm trying to kind of remember that it really is a problem that affects all of us, but that we're not powerless, right? So by improving our understanding of what to expect, then we can make better choices in the future for both hopefully mitigating the climate change, so maybe making policy choices that will lead to less greenhouse gas emissions, but also adaptation. So some of the climate changes are locked in at this point because we've already put so much greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and some are not likely to be mitigated given the current policy landscape. But by improving our understanding of the regional impacts of climate change, there is a lot that we can do. And so I guess I just would want to say that don't lose hope. We are going to be able to figure out how to live in this new world. We just need to understand what it will be like a little more.
More and more people, I'm happy to say, in both political parties are recognizing that climate change is worse, including among Republicans. Recognition of climate science and the fact that we need to do something about it or there will be far worse damage in the future.
There are big divides on climate change, and in particular on beliefs about whether it's human caused. And those tend to break down along basically partisan lines. And that's been pretty persistent over the last maybe 15 years. What we know about what changes that is that it's actually quite hard to change the belief. But I'm not sure we need to necessarily change the kind of meta belief to change behavior, which matters more. So I think about examples in Florida where sea level rise is having impacts now, and where that can be pitched as a local problem that we need to prepare for without particular reference to climate change. You need to take the same action regardless of the cause. And so I actually think we need to move a little bit away from worrying about whether everybody's on the same page about the cause and really thinking about adapting to climate change and what will it take to adapt to climate change.
We have structure of government that has some of the most significant checks and balances in the world, and that makes it very hard for us to do ambitious things on the federal level. And outside of a very significant shift and slew of constitutional amendments, I don't see that changing.
If you look at the changes that people are trying to make in the U.S., they're not big enough. There was a really excellent piece in one of the newspapers recently looking at Santa Barbara. Santa Barbara, you would think, would be the perfect place for dealing with climate changing policies, but we don't. We made some bold claims about we're going to use less fossil fuels by 2030, and we're actually backsliding. We're using more per person and more in the county than we previously had. The situation is actually getting worse here because of things like cars spreading urban sprawl and a variety of other things. People are just not willing to take the tough stance to do something about climate.
But one thing is certain, that the existing system, the policy framework, the existing political system, the existing economic system brought us this problem. And so I'm a firm believer in solving problems using tools that emerge from systems that didn't create the problem. And we've not yet sort of crossed that bridge. Now clearly there are some people whose versions of the Green New Deal I think move us in the right direction, but even most Green New Deals are fundamentally rooted in, even if they are socialist oriented, they're fundamentally rooted in a perspective that believes in infinite economic growth. And we can't have infinite economic growth on a planet with finite resources. So that's got to change. But there are, for example, the Red Deal, the Feminist New Deal, Feminist Green New Deal, and several other models of Green New Deals out there, I think get at this issue. And they certainly understand that, again, at the root of this isn't just that we're burning fossil fuels. At the root of the problem is that we have a system that is controlled by and that benefits a minority of folks who are elites who really don't care about the rest of us and apparently don't care about the future. And so that system isn't going to change just by getting those people out of power and putting nice people, working class people, queer people, people of color in power. That's never going to change it. We actually need to change the system itself. So when I hear the word policy, I sort of bristle, because in my mind, what that generally means is we just need new policies to tweak the existing system. This system is ecocidal, it is genocidal, it is bankrupt, it has to die.
I think that there are a lot of opportunities for students to get involved and to work on these things. And for me, that's how you kind of deal with and you cope with the overwhelming burden of it all, and sort of the depression that comes from realizing how bad things are, is you get involved, you get engaged, you surround yourself with people who are willing to work, right? So I think there's a lot of opportunities to do that on campus at UCSB.
And from my point of view, it's very clear there aren't very many beliefs that are intrinsically human. In other words, everything comes with a culture. And we happen to be in a culture right now that is environmentally disastrous. There are other ways of culturally being. So we really need to think about how we can alter our behavior, alter our culture. And that's humanity's problem. So a lot of people have gotten the memo in the last few years that switching to a largely plant-based diet is a wonderful thing to do for the planet, principally because a third of all methane in the atmosphere is put there by the beef industry. If we could eliminate that, it would make a real dent in the climate crisis. So you should absolutely do that. But something else to keep in mind is a third of the methane put in the atmosphere also comes from the fracking industry, hydraulic fracking for fossil fuels, principally gas and oil. That's a political problem. So even though you can do things individually, like go to a plant-based diet, which is great, you also need to take political action, because if we would stop fracking. We've been petitioning the governor, even before our current governor, we petitioned Jerry Brown to try to literally ban all fracking in California, which he did not do. We need to do that across the country. And the only way you're going to do that is by voting into power people that will do change like that. And that's across the board with things. So, like, I'm a big proponent of biking. I have an e-bike, and I love to bike everywhere. But the thing is, if you don't have good biking infrastructure, it is really difficult to get around. It's really dangerous to get around. So you can do your part personally, but we really need to put people in office who will work toward that. Even little things like local government. Why local government matters? Well, they can put biking infrastructure in that'll make biking a lot easier, which will make a real dent in the climate crisis. And all the way up to the federal government, something like the Green New Deal, which is sweeping change to our climate policy, which is needed. So, yes, individual change is important, collective activism is important, and I always tell people if there's one thing that if you can't do anything else with respect to the climate crisis, I have one thing that you can do. It only takes an hour or two every year, not a lot to do, and that's to go vote.